Have you ever wondered how to protect your peace and personal space from overly nosy neighbors or relatives? While we can't choose our neighbors or family members, we can absolutely set boundaries to preserve tranquility in our lives. Take, for example, the story of John, a man who cherishes privacy and a slow-paced lifestyle in his quiet suburban neighborhood. His mornings are spent jogging through peaceful streets, and his weekends tending to his small garden or reading in the backyard. To him, this was the perfect definition of a simple and happy life. But things started to change when a new neighbor, Margaret, moved in. At first, Margaret seemed like a friendly neighbor, often asking about John's life. Being polite, he answered a few questions, never imagining that her curiosity would soon turn into unwanted prying. In no time, Margaret began closely observing John's daily routines, asking unnecessary questions, making unsolicited comments, and even spreading rumors about his personal life around the neighborhood. The constant curious glances, whispered gossip, and judgmental stares from neighbors left John feeling suffocated in what was once his peaceful sanctuary. John's story reminds us that not everyone knows how to respect personal boundaries. Even a small rumor can be enough to disrupt the peace we hold dear. So, how do you protect your positive energy and steer clear of people who may bring unnecessary trouble into your life? In this video, I'll share with you 3 types of neighbors and 3 types of relatives you should keep your distance from. These tips will help you maintain harmony, protect your living space, and enjoy a more fulfilling life. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more valuable insights to help you build a positive and meaningful life. 1. The nosy neighbor. There's a saying, walls have ears, reminding us that in a close-knit community, keeping your privacy can sometimes feel impossible, especially when there's a neighbor who's constantly listening in. A nosy neighbor isn't just observing, they're prying and embellishing, turning every detail they hear into a more exciting story with each retelling. This type of curiosity quickly becomes a burden for those around them. Simple, everyday events easily turn into neighborhood gossip, your comings and goings, visitors, even private matters you never intended to share. When personal boundaries are crossed, harmless tales can lead to misunderstandings and rob you of the peace everyone deserves in their own home. In this case, keeping a polite distance is often the best way to maintain your tranquility. Respecting boundaries isn't just good manners, it's essential to creating a harmonious and trustworthy community. 2. The complaining, picky neighbor. There's a saying, can't see the forest for the trees, referring to people who get so bogged down in tiny details that they lose sight of the bigger picture. A picky neighbor fixates on every little thing, the smallest sounds, the faintest light, and is quick to get upset over the most trivial matters. They might complain about car doors closing late at night, kids laughing, or even the light coming from a neighboring house. For them, every inconvenience is an excuse to complain, creating a tense atmosphere that lingers in the neighborhood. This constant complaining not only makes others uncomfortable, but makes people feel like they have to walk on eggshells in their own homes. Politely keeping your distance from this type of neighbor can protect your own peace. When you respect others' privacy and don't get tangled in petty grievances, life in your neighborhood can be a whole lot more enjoyable and stress-free. 3. The envious, calculating neighbor. There's a saying, comparison is the thief of joy. When someone is constantly measuring others' success, not only do they rob themselves of happiness, but they create a negative atmosphere for those around them. An envious neighbor sees every success, every moment of joy through a lens of jealousy. Simple things like home improvements, a new purchase, or even a cozy family dinner can easily become a topic for their judgment and comparisons. This type of envy doesn't just affect them, it disrupts harmony within the community. When someone is always looking for flaws or resenting others' happiness, they inadvertently create a negative, tense environment for everyone. Judgmental glances and subtle digs make others feel scrutinized within their own living spaces. As the saying goes, envy is the art of counting someone else's blessings instead of your own. This kind of behavior doesn't just steal others' joy, it also strips away their own peace of mind. With an envious neighbor, maintaining a bit of distance is essential to protect your happiness and peace. By choosing to ignore judgmental remarks and jealous glances, you can focus on enjoying your own life with gratitude, unbothered by others' comparisons. Learning to stay unfazed and keeping a friendly but firm boundary can create a gentle yet effective line, keeping you from getting dragged into negative energy. A peaceful living space requires balance, sometimes. That balance comes from keeping envious energy at bay to preserve your optimism and tranquility. In a quiet suburban neighborhood, people lived close and familiar with one another, while still respecting each other's private space. Life was calm and friendly until Mrs. Nancy moved in. She was a woman in her 60s who lived alone, with a welcoming smile and sharp eyes that missed nothing. From the start, Mrs. Nancy took notice of every detail in the neighborhood, both big and small, treating each bit of gossip like a precious little treasure. Initially, everyone welcomed Mrs. Nancy warmly, thinking of her as an easygoing neighbor who enjoyed a friendly chat. But soon, people began to realize that Nancy was more than just friendly. She was the ultimate know-it-all. In particular, Lisa, a picky and hard-to-please neighbor, was the first to feel the intrusion of Mrs. Nancy's probing questions. Lisa, a single middle-aged woman, was known throughout the neighborhood for her fussiness and her desire for absolute quiet. Any sound louder than birdsong seemed to bother her, and she wasn't shy about complaining to the homeowners association. At first, when she heard Mrs. Nancy share stories about other neighbors, Lisa was intrigued and even a little curious. But over time, she realized that no one escaped Mrs. Nancy's scrutiny, and soon enough, she became one of Nancy's topics of conversation herself. One day, another neighbor, Mr. Mark, threw a birthday party for his grandchild. It was a small, cozy gathering, but with music and laughter that filled the neighborhood air. Mrs. Nancy, as expected, took note, listening carefully to every sound coming from Mark's house, and eagerly reported it to Lisa. "Did you notice how noisy Mark's house was today?" she whispered to Lisa. "There must be something special going on." Lisa frowned, nodding in agreement, and remarked, "I just don't get it. Don't they consider how loud they're being?" Seeing Lisa's annoyance, Mrs. Nancy felt satisfied and added even more details about the supposed commotion at Mr. Mark's party. Before long, Lisa called the homeowners association, insisting they remind Mr. Mark to keep it down. A few days later, Lisa noticed that Mr. Mark no longer greeted her with his usual friendly smile. When he learned that Lisa had complained about his grandchild's birthday party, he felt insulted. To him, Lisa had shown herself to be petty and bothersome. Even though Mr. Mark hadn't ever been particularly close with Mrs. Nancy, he started finding her presence unpleasant as well, realizing that even the simplest events could become neighborhood gossip. One evening, Lisa spotted a friend visiting Mr. Mark's house, sparking her curiosity once more. She turned to Mrs. Nancy to ask about the mysterious guest. Mrs. Nancy replied, "Oh, I think that person is quite special to him." They were laughing and chatting like old friends. Hearing this, Lisa felt even more annoyed, thinking that Mr. Mark was far too open with his life and didn't care about how it affected the neighbors. The next morning, as Lisa was in her garden, Mrs. Nancy came over and asked, "Lisa, did you hear voices coming from Mr. Mark's house last night? I think he was being a bit loud." Lisa nodded immediately, adding that Mr. Mark seems like the type who doesn't respect the neighborhood's peace and quiet. Hearing this, Mrs. Nancy gave a knowing nod and didn't miss the chance to share this version of the story with other neighbors. However, Mr. Mark overheard from another neighbor that Mrs. Nancy was spreading rumors about his mysterious guests, who supposedly visited frequently in the evenings. He felt both angry and disappointed that his private conversations had become fodder for gossip. Tensions escalated further when Mr. Mark decided to rebuild his fence and renovate his yard. The project lasted several days. With construction noise and workers coming and going, Lisa couldn't stand the noise and filed another complaint with the homeowners association, accusing Mr. Mark of showing off. Feeling insulted and belittled, Mr. Mark decided to distance himself from both Lisa and Mrs. Nancy, now seeing them as unfriendly neighbors. Ironically, it was Mrs. Nancy, whom both Mr. Mark and Lisa had once trusted, who kept stirring the pot. She even complained about both of them to other neighbors, indirectly creating more division in the neighborhood. Soon enough, people realized that being too close to Mrs. Nancy only meant their own lives would become the latest topic of gossip. Gradually, both Mr. Mark and Lisa grew weary of the tense atmosphere in the neighborhood. They chose to keep their distance, making sure Mrs. Nancy no longer knew any details about their personal lives. Mr. Mark would only offer a quick greeting when he saw Mrs. Nancy, while Lisa avoided contact with her altogether. Other neighbors started doing the same, and Mrs. Nancy eventually found herself isolated in her own home. After all the tension and misunderstandings, the small neighborhood finally regained its peace. But it wasn't the same kind of closeness as before. It was a colder kind of peace, where everyone kept their distance, no longer interested in forming deep connections with each other. There's an old saying, a distant relative isn't as valuable as a close neighbor. Neighbors, more than anyone, are the people we encounter often, deeply influencing our daily lives. While we can choose our friends, neighbors aren't something we have the freedom to select. For this reason, there are always certain types of neighbors we should cautiously keep a distance from if we want to preserve our family's peace and avoid unnecessary trouble. We can't always count on family when unexpected situations arise. A distant resource can't put out a nearby fire. Often, it's the support of neighbors that gets us through tough times, especially during those darkest hours. But there are certain types of neighbors who, if we get too close, may bring unforeseen complications into our lives. As the saying goes, one wrong choice can bring long-term inconvenience. Because with neighbors, you can't easily avoid them, nor can you simply change who lives nearby. Work conflicts, if unresolved, can lead us to seek a new job. But with neighbors, it's a fixed issue. We can't just move away due to a few inconveniences. That's why living close but knowing where to draw the line is the best way to protect your own peace while fostering a harmonious, balanced neighborhood relationship. Good neighbors aren't always easy to find, but the way we handle our interactions will determine our own tranquility. Keep a respectful distance to avoid unnecessary hassles and maintain a peaceful, balanced relationship. Have you ever encountered neighbors like these? Share your story in the comments, and let's find ways to preserve peace in our lives. Up next, we'll discuss the 3 types of family members you may want to keep at arm's length. Curious who they are? Stay tuned. First, relatives who seek relationships for their own benefit. There's a saying, when you're struggling, no one comes around. When you're successful, family shows up from all directions. These relatives tend to appear only when you're at the height of success, looking for ways to gain something for themselves. They might be distant cousins or even close family members, but they treat family relationships as opportunities for personal gain. These individuals don't care about your feelings or struggles and will quickly disappear when things don't go your way. Getting too close to this type of relative often leads to feelings of being used and disappointed. By keeping a healthy distance, you can protect your assets, time, and peace of mind without getting entangled in unreasonable demands. Second, lazy, unmotivated relatives. In a family, we're always willing to help our relatives through tough times, but there are limits. Relatives who are lazy, lack motivation, and constantly rely on others for help can drain you, both emotionally and financially. They regularly ask for assistance, but never make an effort to change or improve their own situation. These people may take advantage of your kindness, consuming your time and money without showing any appreciation. For this type of relative, it's wise to set clear boundaries so you don't get pulled into an endless cycle of demands. Third, jealous and calculating relatives. Relatives who are envious of others' success often make family relationships tense. They don't just stop at feeling jealous. They may gossip, compare themselves to your accomplishments, and even try to bring you down if given the chance. This jealousy might come from a place of insecurity or lack, and it can damage not only the peace but also the trust within the family. When dealing with envious and calculating relatives, keeping your distance can help protect your own joy and accomplishments, preventing you from getting dragged into unnecessary comparisons. Sometimes, a harmonious family relationship doesn't need to be overly close. It just requires respect and understanding of each other's boundaries. Now, here is Sarah's story. Sarah was a successful woman in her 30s, living in a small town on the outskirts of a big city, known for her intelligence, perseverance, and dedication to her work. She was the pride of her family, especially her mother, Eleanor, who held a deep love and pride for her only child. Everything would have remained ordinary if Sarah's Uncle Jim, Eleanor's younger brother, hadn't unexpectedly visited Sarah one Saturday morning with a request in hand. Uncle Jim was a good-humored man, but he hadn't had much luck with work. Throughout his younger years, he worked hard, but stability had always been out of reach. Once a skilled carpenter, Jim's health began to decline after an accident a few years prior. Now, he lived with his family in an old, run-down house on the outskirts of the city and was struggling to support his 2 children. Eleanor knew her brother's situation, and for a long time, she'd offered to help him, but Jim always declined, not wanting to be a burden. However, one morning, Jim showed up at Sarah's door with an awkward look on his face, holding an envelope in his hands. He sat on her sofa, looking around her spacious home, and hesitantly said, "Sarah, could you lend me some money? Just a small amount. I'll pay you back as soon as I can." Though surprised, Sarah remained calm and asked, "What's going on, Uncle Jim? Are you going through some hard times?" After a moment, Jim explained his situation. He was short on funds to cover his older son's school fees, and without that money, his son might have to drop out. Sarah listened carefully, feeling a wave of emotions wash over her. She wanted to help her uncle, but she was concerned about his ability to repay. As her mother had told her before that Jim was already in debt to many people, Eleanor had also advised her to be cautious, as unpaid loans could turn into a financial burden. Sarah was in a tough spot. She cared deeply for her Uncle Jim and her 2 younger cousins, but she also understood that financial help wasn't always the right choice. Just as she was weighing her options, Eleanor walked out from the kitchen. Seeing her brother sitting there, she smiled warmly and said gently, "Jim, how are you?" Jim looked at Eleanor, slightly embarrassed. He knew his sister had always wanted to help him, but out of pride, he had never asked her for a dime. Eleanor sat down and started chatting, but soon she noticed the awkwardness in her brother's eyes and the conflicted expression on Sarah's face. After listening to Jim's story, Eleanor looked at her daughter with a knowing gaze. She understood Sarah's hesitation, which reminded her of all the times she'd helped her brother without ever expecting anything in return. She looked at Sarah and softly said, "Sarah, I believe we shouldn't place too much emphasis on financial matters within the family. Your uncle is going through a rough patch, and if you're able to help him a little, I think it's the right thing to do." Sarah looked at her mother, holding back her emotions. She loved her mom and always wanted to make her happy, but she also knew that if she helped Jim this time, he might come back for more in the future. For someone already in significant debt, like Jim, this could be a double-edged sword, and she didn't want to become financially responsible for the entire family. Taking a deep breath, Sarah calmly replied, "I understand, Mom. I'll think it over." After Uncle Jim left, Sarah turned to her mother and gently said, "Mom, I know you care deeply for him, but sometimes there have to be limits on how we help. I'm genuinely concerned that if I help him this time, he'll lean on it and keep asking whenever things get tough." Eleanor fell silent, feeling the weight of her daughter's concerns. She knew Sarah was right, but as a mother, she had always believed that family bonds were sacred and worth preserving. She placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder and said, "My dear, I understand how you feel, but remember, in tough times, family is the greatest support we have. If you can help, do so with kindness, and let life teach them about responsibility." Sarah thought long and hard about her mother's words. In the end, she decided to lend Uncle Jim a small amount to cover her cousin's tuition, but with one condition: "I'll help you this time, Uncle Jim, but I need you to save up and manage things better in the future. Family is here for support, but everyone has to stand on their own feet." The next day, Sarah called Uncle Jim to let him know her decision. Though slightly embarrassed, he thanked her in the end. After this, Sarah saw Uncle Jim less frequently, but when they did meet, She remained friendly and encouraged him to keep pushing through. She realized that unconditional help wasn't always possible, and that sometimes distance is necessary for people to take responsibility. Several months after assisting Uncle Jim, Sarah noticed changes in his behavior. Jim began to act shy whenever he visited her, no longer freely asking to borrow money or seeking favors as before. He started trying to manage on his own instead of turning to his niece. Their encounters were no longer burdened by dependency or financial obligations. Both gradually regained comfort as their relationship was built on a foundation of respect and accountability. Sarah realized that by offering limited help, she preserved her own dignity and prevented Uncle Jim from becoming a burden on the family. She felt relieved as he gradually learned to take care of his family without relying on others' support. Family gatherings now felt natural, free from the shadow of financial worries. Aunt Eleanor, witnessing her brother's positive transformation and her daughter's decisive actions, no longer felt burdened. She knew Sarah had done right by providing just enough help. With clear boundaries, peace slowly returned to the family, and Sarah understood that while support could be given within a family, it also needed limits to maintain a healthy relationship. From Sarah's story, we learn profound lessons about the importance of maintaining boundaries in family relationships. Family is a place where everyone expects to share and support each other, but sometimes, closeness can blur personal boundaries. Unlimited help leads to dependency, diminishing the recipient's worth and creating emotional strain for the helper. In family relationships, when relatives feel entitled to depend and demand unconditional support, the line between kinship and responsibility becomes blurred. A person who gives too much might find themselves losing freedom, while the recipient might lose the motivation to be self-reliant. Like Sarah, if we don't set limits, helping can turn into a vicious cycle, eventually leading to negative feelings. From disappointment to suffocation in the relationship, kinship doesn't mean having to shoulder each other's difficulties. Respect is the foundation of all relationships. Setting boundaries is not an act of selfishness, but a way to protect both parties. Maintaining balance in each relationship, when individuals learn to take responsibility for their own lives, family ties can become a source of encouragement and valuable support, not a burden to bear. We want to hear from you. What do you think about setting boundaries in family relationships? Have you ever felt awkward when having to help a relative? Share your thoughts in the comments section below. Thank you for watching, and see you in our next stories.